Pat Mayo experience, it's time to dive into the strategy behind winning some Mondays at DraftKings Baseball. Joining me on the line to preview what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong, maybe some tips and tricks and the difference between stats you should target, stats you shouldn't, cash games, tournaments, everything like that. It is Mike Leone from DailyRoto.com. What is happening, my man?
I'm getting excited for baseball season, just a couple weeks away. It starts pretty early this year, March 29th. We should have a fun opening day. It's a Thursday, I believe, randomly, and we actually get all the teams playing on opening day instead of that, fake tease Sunday night baseball opening day that we've gotten a few of the past years. So it should be a lot of fun.
Are you a purist where you demand that Cincinnati has the first game?
No, I'm not really a purist, but I do think it's fun to have everyone play at once instead of that one or two games the day before.
Well, that'll make the original slate of the season a really juicy one to play, and you don't get the tease of that Sunday night. We can jump right into it. So let's do that right now in terms of strategy. So we're going to try to help people become better DraftKings MLB players. So first off, before we get into some of the differences between cash games and tournaments and that kind of thing and tournament selection, what are just a few basic things that people need to know that they're probably doing wrong?
Yeah, I think if you're new to fantasy baseball or into DFS baseball in general, one of the things that you want to start with in your, it's hard to have this conversation without delineating cash games and tournaments.
All right, okay. Well, you know what? Let's start with cash games then. We'll start with cash games. First of all, can you tell people the difference between cash games and tournaments if you want to be a winning player overall?
Yeah, so a cash game is going to be any game like a 50-50 head-to-head type game where your win rate, if you're better than the average player over time, you're going to win. And even on a given night, you just have to be better than average. Whereas a tournament, obviously, you need to have a top-heavy prize pool and you need a more contrarian strategy. So picking guys with lower ownership, guys with higher upside, you need more correlation in your lineup. Correlation's huge with tournaments. When we say correlation, we mean stacking in MLB DFS, so taking multiple hitters from the same team because their success to one another is tied heavily together. But let's shift over to cash games. I think one thing for beginners where they really want to start is the pitching side of things. There's a lot more predictability day to day in pitchers than there is with hitters. And specifically strikeout rates for pitchers have a high amount of predictability. You see, I looked at the correlation of pitchers, some pitchers' season-long stats to their individual start stats in strikeout rate, ERA, and WHIP, which are pretty standard fantasy stats. And strikeout rate has more than double the correlation than either ERA to WHIP to those start-to-start games. And that's just because things like batting average of balls in play, home run rates on a single game are really prone to luck and to variance, whereas a pitcher's strikeout rate is more controllable because they're facing, 20 plus batters. We know what their strikeout percentage per batter faced is, and there's a lot more time for that to weed itself out. And then when you couple that with the fact that strikeouts are worth a lot of points, they happen at quite a frequent amount of time, it just comes back to strikeouts are king in daily fantasy baseball. So I think you want to start with your pitching staff first. And in particular, you really want to start with evaluating pitchers that are going to have good strikeout rates on a given day.
So in terms of cash games, we always think of those as inheriting less risk. But how often are you paying up for a pitcher versus paying down for a pitcher, or just trying to find a nice balance between two high strikeout guys?
I'll give you the usual cop-out that each slate, of course, is unique, especially in fantasy baseball, where we get some slates where we have games in Coors Field. And sometimes that will supersede the starting pitcher priority because there's going to be so many runs scored. You need exposure to that game. But more times than not, I'm usually paying up in at least one starting pitcher spot. Of course, you always want to take advantage of guys that are going to be underpriced, and that's going to come with your day-to-day evaluation. But I do think in cash games, you can definitely get away with spending a little bit less on your hitters because you're going to have even Mike Trout, for example. I think it was around 40% of his games last year, he scored less than 10 fantasy points, 10 DraftKings points, I think, or it might have been from 0 to 5. But you're going to get even the best hitters, even in really good spots, they're going to put up goose eggs. They're going to put 0 on a day or 3 to 5 points, which really isn't going to move the needle. Whereas you have a pitcher where you're projecting them for 20 points, there might be a decent shot they get those 20 points, and someone who's forcing these high priced hitters into their lineup can end up with these cheap pitchers that can actually go negative, and you can end up with a 20-point gap between the pitcher you took and the pitcher someone else took. And even if they're devoting a lot of money to hitters, more so than you are, it's hard to make up for that gap on a day-to-day basis. And that's one of the reasons why cash games are very different than tournament games.
So as it pertains to hitting versus pitching, so in a giant tournament lineup, in a GPP, stacking would become a thing to try to maximize the upside of your lineup, try to get all those correlations. Two guys get on base, another guy hits a home run, you get all the runs, you get the RBIs for it all, and boom, you're at the top of the standings. How does that work in cash games, though? Should you still be stacking?
I don't think you need to stack in cash games, and there might even be some reasons you wouldn't because of that correlation. Actually, in tournaments, you like the upside the correlation creates, but there's downside, right? If a team gets shut out or something and you've stacked them in cash games, it's going to be very difficult to win. So I will stack in cash games if it happens naturally. If three guys at three different positions on the same team happen to be the best values at that position, I'm okay with that. I probably try not to full stack and go 4 or 5 guys on a team unless it's like a really short slate or really extreme situation. But 2 to 3 guys, I think, is absolutely fine. And generally, you will have a couple guys on the same team because they're in the same matchup, the same good hitters part, for example. And I think that makes sense. But you do want to be weary of full stacking in cash games because the correlated downside, again, you just have to be better than average. So you don't really want a strategy where your team's either finishing in the top 20th percentile or they're finishing in the bottom, 40th percentile for cash games. That's a tournament strategy. You want whatever strategy helps you be better than the average DFS user score on a given day. And I don't think that stacking is something that you should actively be trying to do in cash games as a result.
So when we target hitters for cash games, then do we always take guys that hit, let's say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in a lineup, knowing that you could maximize their at-bats that way?
Maximizing plate appearance is really important in MLB DFS, and I think it's something that can get overlooked at times. One thing that Logan Hitchcock and I, we wrote an MLB DFS book called Painting the Edge, deep data in MLB DFS prior to last year's MLB season. And what I tried to look at was the boost that lineup spots get agnostic of skill based on whether a hitter's on the home or on the road, but also by team totals. And I think, and by when I say team total, I mean for each game, you can figure out how much Vegas is projecting that team to score based on the money line odds and the overall game total. So that comes into play because someone who's hitting, let's say, 5th on the road and has a team total of 5 is actually going to get more of a boost than a leadoff home hitter who has a team total of 3, which is, sometimes interesting, and people will defer to that hitter with the team total of 3 just because they're hitting leadoff and they'd rather take a leadoff hitter than a 5 or a 6 hitter. So you got to take that all into account. But at the end of the day, you do want to try and maximize plate appearances. If you're constantly getting less plate appearances than your opponent, you're likely losing more times than not. So you want to try and get more plate appearances than your opponent, or at least very close. And you want to try and avoid teams with team totals less than 4, even in cash games.
So how often in cash games would you be willing to put someone who, let's say, hit 7th, 8th, or 9th in a lineup? Would you do it?
I would do it. They would have to have a really high team total, and they probably have to be on the road. And the reason why we like road bottom of the order hitters better than home bottom of the order hitters, really, if the team total is the same, we prefer a road hitter to a home hitter because they get that guaranteed 9th inning, Pat, and that's a big deal. Whereas the home team, if they're winning going in the bottom of the 9th, they don't get to hit the bottom of the 9th. It's over. And you'll see times.
I guess the one thing with that, though, is unless the game is a low-scoring game, that if the home team doesn't get a chance to bat in the 9th inning, don't we presume that they've scored a bunch of runs?
Not necessarily. They've scored more runs, but if you do the math over time, the away hitters in similar total games are getting more plate appearances than the home hitters probably by 0.2 per game, which doesn't sound like a lot, but you run the math over time, every 5 days, if you're taking a comparable road hitter to comparable home hitter, you're increasing your plate appearance. So that's assuming they score like a similar amount of runs. There's obviously some unpredictability to that, but I do think when you're doing the top of the order hitters, maybe it doesn't matter as much, but going back to your original question about the bottom of the order hitters, you want that extra out because a lot of times these hitters are only getting the three plate appearances. And I'd also be careful about these hitters in the National League who are bottom of the order because
double
pinch hit
you get the pinch hit, and then you get the, God forbid, the double switch coming in, taking them out.
Double switch. Doesn't Anderkers have an anti-double switch take, or
I'm sure he hates the American League. He hates the designated hitter, so I assume he's very pro double switch.
Oh, okay. Maybe that's what it was. But yeah, you want to be careful with that. And sorry, I feel like I was a little all over the place with that answer. But at the end of the day, yes, you want to maximize plate appearances. If you have a high team total on a team and it's a day where you need to fit in an expensive pitcher, I am willing to take a 7, 8, 9 hitter. I just would much rather prefer that 7, 8, 9 hitter be on the road and be on an American League team.
As it pertains to team totals in baseball, we know that in football, if you're like above 25 points as a projected team total, that's a pretty high scoring team. Or if you get like into the 50s as an overall game total, that's a really high over-under. What is it for baseball? What would be considered a high team total?
So I think on average, you're looking at like 4 to 4.5 as like your average team total. So 5 is good, 5.5 is really good. Anything 6 or more is awesome. And then on the low side, 3.5 to 4, we don't like so much. 4 is like okay. Anything below 3.5 is pretty bad. And I will say there's always a lot of controversy around using Vegas information for DFS actionability. And I think what some people do mistakenly is they just say, okay, the correlation between the Vegas team total and how many runs the team actually scores, it's not that high. I think it's like 0.25 or so. And people say, well, is it really helping that much? And I do think that's a flawed way mathematically to look at it, because really what Vegas is doing is they're not trying to guess the average a team would score on a given day. They're just trying to guess the median amount, because that's what they're doing. They're setting a line that want around equal action on both sides. And the way to do that is to find the median expectation. So if you can rank the teams in terms of median expectation of runs scored in a somewhat accurate rate, like that's a big deal to me. And I've seen the data play that out. While you might not have this huge correlation from Vegas team total, the amount of runs scored, if you look at fantasy information, basically I diced it up which way you could, looking at leadoff hitter on the road versus leadoff hitter on the home, at various different team totals. And the overall trend, you start getting a higher percentage boost just based on context, the higher that team total goes up. So to me, it's something that really matters, even if you can't draw that exact A to B correlation that some people just really want to see before they use it.
I would think that using Vegas totals would actually be a pretty prudent move, though, because Vegas and a lot of online books, when they set their lines right now, well, they are looking for equal action. The markets have become so efficient with this stuff because there are so many people like yourself, like many around the world, that are building their own models to project this stuff out. So their models and what they're predicting had to be the absolute best of the best so they don't get taken by anyone.
Absolutely. And the important thing is it's one piece of information that helps us. Like, we can tweak it. It doesn't mean that I'm saying you can't take a leadoff hitter with a 4 team total over a leadoff hitter with a 5 team total, because you're going to take into account, the park factors. You're going to take into account the skill of the two players. So you're going to take a lot into account. It's just all else equal. The higher the team total, the better that player over time is going to produce because of the boost that they get from that. And one thing, bringing it back to stacking, we talked about in tournaments, there is some merit to not necessarily stacking the team with the highest team total, because anyone can look and say, okay, the Red Sox have the highest team total on the slate, right? I'm going to stack them. So you want to take into account ownership. That's going to be very important in tournaments. But the other thing too is, while we might start looking at team totals, the way different hitters accumulate fantasy points is going to matter. So last year, for example, we saw the Boston Red Sox with a lot of high team totals. They weren't always very good stacks. One, they were expensive, so you weren't drawing a lot of value out of them because they always had a high team total, so they were priced accordingly. And 2, you didn't have a lot of event type players. When I talk about event type players, you're talking guys who hit home runs, hit stolen bases, because not all acts in fantasy baseball are scored equally. Home runs and steals really give you a huge edge. So obviously they had Mookie Betts there, who was a good event type player. But beyond that, you had guys like, Dustin Pedroia, who's not going to, put up a bunch of event type statistics. And, we saw that with the Royals a couple of years ago too. They're more of like, base to base type team. So even if they scored 5 or 6 runs, they weren't necessarily putting up a ton of DFS points. So again, Vegas is a very good piece of information in my opinion, but of course you're just using that to layer it in to everything. It's not the end all be all.
Well, this kind of harkens back to actually finding value in making your selections for cash games, where the Vegas totals, that's a part of it. Finding people who are hitting in the right part of the order, that's a part of it. They're not the main parts of it, but they're all just a piece of how you actually end up finding value. So how do you actually assess real value when it comes to finding guys in cash games?
Yeah, so I like the way you said that, because how they're pieces. Because in MLB DFS, there's not one thing that's going to have a really high correlation to anything else. In fact, most things have a pretty low correlation individually. It's putting together the pieces of the puzzle. So in an ideal world where you'd want your hitter, you'd want a good team total, you'd want a good lineup spot, you'd want a good hitter's park. And you'd want him to have obviously some skill. So the skill statistics I like to look at are weighted on base average and isolated power. And what I found is, while ideally, if you had the time, you'd break down every single component, like what's the player's home run rate, walk rate, K rate, and you'd be able to simulate all these outcomes. The average person's not going to be able to do that. But what I found, if you add weighted on base average and ISO together, it has a very high correlation to a player's fantasy points per plate appearance if you strip out the RBIs and runs scored. So I'm kind of looking at this in 2 different ways. One, I want to see what the player per plate appearance should do based on their skill. And that's looking at their weighted on base average and their ISO, and then maybe adjusting that for the opposing pitcher, whether you have the platoon edge or not. And then the other aspect is layering in the team total and the lineup spot to tell me how many plate appearances are they going to have most likely, and how likely are they to be involved in run scoring events so that they can rack up runs scored and RBIs.
All right, so we've now taken a few pieces of the pie and put it all together. So what is sort of the optimal construction for a cash game lineup? And I know that's going to be dependent on what the slate is. Do you start with your pitchers first, though?
I usually work from my pitchers out. I think that's the best way to start for 2 reasons. One, as I said before, I think that in cash games, the predictability of the position makes that a position you want to prioritize. But when we say prioritize, it doesn't mean you have to take the most expensive pitcher. You want to take the most, you still want to get the most value out of the position. So I just want to be clear there, because I think sometimes people hear, oh, pitcher is important, it's predictable, I have to play Clayton Kershaw every day. But if the prices are done accordingly, you're not going to be able to fit that pitcher in. So I just want to be clear there. But I do start with the pitchers. And also the research for the pitchers is going to help you decide, which pitchers do you want to pick on and which pitchers you definitely want to stay away from when you're doing your hitters. The one exception would be if you get a game with a really high game total, where teams have team totals of like 6.5, 6, 7, anywhere in that range. Because those are such outlier games that you're really, that's when the predictability of the hitting side starts to inch up a little bit more when you get team totals that extreme. We see it in Coors Field quite often. There are some circumstances when that happens where I will make sure I get exposure to those hitters, even if it costs me a pitcher value that I like.
So what do we do in terms of tournament selection? Are there better cash games to play? Should you be targeting 50-50? Should you be targeting double-ups, head-to-heads, three-mans? What is the best way you think for, not the most advanced player, because most advanced players is why they're advanced players. They know this kind of thing. But if it's me, I don't play a lot of DraftKings baseball. If I wanted to get into it this year, where's a better spot for me to start at?
I've always found my ROI in cash games is higher in the large field double up contests, where you have to finish, because of the rake, I think it's like top 45% or somewhere around there. And you straight double up your money. So if you enter $5 and you're in a cash spot, whether your first cash spot or the last cash spot, you're going to get back $10 and double up your money. And I just find that the competition in those seems to be softer, especially the lower stakes ones that are really, really large field. I will caveat that with, I've shifted a lot of my bankroll to playing more tournaments, in the past 2 years, maybe dramatically so, where I used to play 90% cash games, 10% tournaments. I've almost flipped that completely, which some people are surprised to hear. But I just think that the cash games are getting more efficient as time goes on. And with baseball being a high variance sport, I just do like kind of applying that game theory and whatnot to tournaments. But you do have to be very cognizant of your bankroll management, because if you're playing tournaments, remember your cash rate based on randomness, like the top 20% you have to finish in to cash in a tournament. And some of those lower end cash spots, you're not even doubling up your money. Whereas a cash game, if you're in the top 40 to 50%, you're generally doubling your money, maybe minus the rate, depending what format. So you're obviously going to get a lot more consistency day to day in your cash games. So if you're going to do an approach like me, where you're playing primarily tournaments, you have to understand that you could go a couple weeks with barely cashing and losing money. You probably could lose money over a full month, really pretty easily. So you want to be very smart about your bankroll management if you're going to take a tournament heavy approach.
If you're going to play one of those giant double ups, is it best to enter a tournament that allows multiple entries? Let's say you're just playing one lineup. Do you want to play in a giant double up that has multiple entries, or do you want to try to find like the single entry ones to go into?
For cash games?
Yes.
I think you want to play the larger the field, the better, I think, for cash games, because I think you just get more people in there that are more likely to make mistakes. If people are making multiple entries and they are, diluting some of the best plays, you can get people that are entering suboptimal lineups. Or even if you enter, some of those games where there's large field double ups, people are afraid to enter because they see, a shark username entering a whole lot of the same lineup. And they're like, well, I don't want to compete against 100 lineups of a shark. Well, that 100 lineups out of, thousands of entries is actually a lower percentage than if that shark has one lineup out of 20 entries in a smaller field, single entry double up game. So you have to keep that in mind, that I actually think that the competition you're playing against is probably a little bit softer overall, and the overall strength of the lineups are a little bit less the larger the field the double ups are.
If you were to play head-to-heads, would you want to enter a cash lineup, a tournament lineup, or some mix of both?
A cash lineup. I think you're just trying to, again, just that 50th percentile. I want to be better than average is all you're aiming for. So definitely a cash game lineup.
Are there, I know you don't need to name specific players, but are there certain things that you can pick up? Be like, oh, I want to avoid that guy. He has the badge next to his name, that kind of thing.
I mein, DraftKings has these features for a reason. I do think, you can take advantage of blocking certain players from picking up your head-to-head games. I think everyone should do that, because the idea is to increase your ROI. So if you know a really talented player has been picking up your games, I would take advantage of that. And also, I have found that if you can go through the games and pick up games against players that don't have badges, you might play against someone who's really good, but probably they're not going to be as good as someone with a badge. So any little edge you can get helps. So I would certainly be cognizant of that when selecting your games. And, part of the reason why I've played more tournaments is I've probably lacked the necessary patience to do all those little things that might add as much to your expected value as picking an actual team could.
Does ownership on any certain players in cash games matter in terms of double ups and 50-50s? Or can you leverage yourself into a good spot where this one pitcher will be owned by 70% of the people in a cash game, so you just don't take him and hope he busts?
That's more of a tournament strategy to me. I think that you just want to put out the best lineup you possibly can in cash games. If you start getting into three-mans, which I still consider a cash game, that's when you might want to kind of blend a cash game with a tournament approach, where if you are uncertain on a 70% pitcher, sometimes in a head-to-head, I'll play the guy that I'm uncertain on that I know is going to be chalk, because I don't have a lot of confidence one way or the other, and I'd rather beat them elsewhere. I don't want to lose, on that spot where I know it's going to be chalk. If you're in a three-man and you're uncertain, maybe that's where you've take into account the ownership and you fade, because if the two other guys take that pitcher and he busts, your returns, 3-1. It's taken into account the ownership disparity, and you might want to touch more correlation, maybe some mini stacks in your 3-mans or even 5-man games, which start to get closer to like a tournament type contest. But as far as the games where you just need to be top 45 to 50%, I'm really not taking into ownership very much at all.
All right, let's talk tournaments then. What is the single biggest thing for beginners that they need to know between tournaments and cash games?
I think the biggest thing we covered is stacking. I think that's really the most important thing, is understanding stacking. But the second thing beyond that is realizing the variance of fantasy baseball. And it's difficult because we don't necessarily know the ownership percentages ahead of time. We can make our best guesses, we can be wrong, but I am much more likely to fade a chalky hitter in a tournament than I am a chalky pitcher. Because again, going back to the predictability of pitching, and the opportunity cost is also very different. You know, if you're fading Chris Sale in a really good matchup and the price is okay, he's likely going to have a really good game. And if he doesn't, you know, it's difficult to find a pitcher that can match that upside somewhere else, unless there's another stud pitching on that day. So let's assume there's not. It's just difficult to find that upside. You know, we talked about the K rate, how there's a higher correlation of a pitcher's season-long K rate to their season-long starts. It's about 0.42 is what I found. If you are a pitcher that doesn't throw a lot of innings and doesn't have that high of a K rate, how are you going to match Chris Sale's ceiling? Like, there aren't a lot of ways that you can get there. Very few. On the hitting side of things, Mike Trout could score 0 easily 20+% of the time. And then you can get a hitter who maybe even isn't that good or is comparable. You've got a lot more comparable pivots, though, that could hit a home run and steal a base. And all of a sudden you're outscoring Trout by 20 points. You know, that's the type of thing that's not happening as frequently on the pitching side as the hitting side. So on the hitting side, I really wouldn't be afraid to go contrarian.
So if we're going to do that, ownership is so much baked into this. If you're trying to find a pivot play, if you're trying to find a contrarian play, how do you project ownership?
Projecting ownership is difficult. I think you've got to just, you know, be on Twitter, keep your kind of hand on the pulse, and just see all the articles that are being put out. You know, what we're putting out on Daily Roto, what you guys are putting out with DK Edge stuff, and you know what Roto Grinder, some of the other sites are putting out. Just, you can kind of get a pretty quick gauge without even reading all of the articles, just on headlines and just skimming them what you can, of the type of plays people are on, and follow as many DFS personalities as possible. And I think that's going to give you an idea. As I said with stacks, I think team totals, while it can be controversial over how important that is, at the end of the day, I think those will play heavily in the top owned teams as far as stacks go, where, you know, quite often the best stack is the team with the third highest team total, because their chances of success aren't that different than the top two teams, but the ownership gets converged on those top two teams. So I think the best ways to gauge ownership is pretty much just by following as much DFS content as possible, looking at the Vegas team totals. And the final piece would just be, you typically see people picking on the same starting pitchers over and over again, because a lot of models work, you know, somewhat similarly. Everybody's going to pick on Mike Pelfrey, for example. And if he's pitching on a day, you might know, okay, maybe I want to pick on another bad starting pitcher that's not as popular of a situation.
You said you were more inclined to go chalk at pitcher over hitter in giant tournaments. Does that depend on the size of the field of the tournament?
Yeah, it does. In smaller field tournaments, the difficult conversation with tournaments in all sports is, what I found is that ownership percentages get more inflated in like single entry and 3-max type tournaments. So on one hand, you're not competing against thousands and thousands of teams. So you don't need to be as off the wall, as crazy to come up with the best lineup. On the other hand, if the ownerships are inflated, your potential reward for fading a chalky position is even higher, or your chances of winning if a certain situation plays out are even higher. So that's a dilemma, Pat, that I find. I don't know how you approach it in golf. I find that to be a really interesting dilemma where, you know, at first glance, it might seem like you should be more contrarian in these large field tournaments, but then at second glance, it's the single entry and 3 maxes where that reward pays off more consistently.
And it's hard to equate baseball, it would seem, to any of the other sports as you're trying to construct lineups. Obviously, there's a lot different. I find golf correlates the best with football, actually, because you have an idea of what's going to happen going into the week. You're dealing with a very large slate in terms of players to pick from and a lot of different combinations. It seems like in baseball, people can pigeonhole themselves into similar roster construction builds, and then the only thing that can really differentiate their team is a pivot here and there off one of the really chalky players. So maybe it's a lot like basketball. I don't know. I mean, I rarely play basketball and baseball, so I really don't have an idea. But I don't find that baseball is a lot like golf or football, in my mind at least.
Yeah, that's interesting. I definitely wouldn't say it's like basketball, but I think basketball in a way is kind of the most unique sport because of the predictability game to game. I'm most likely to eat the chalk. But circling back to the base question that you asked me about what to do in like a single entry 3 max type tournament, I might go chalky with one pitcher that I really, and of course there's always good chalk and bad chalk. Like if you naturally don't like a chalky player, that's the perfect time to fade that player in tournaments. Like you never want to force yourself to take a player that's chalky in tournaments because you're afraid of fading. Like that doesn't make sense. If you feel like you have an edge somewhere, you want to take advantage of that. Where it gets harder is where you like the player and you know he's going to be chalk and you don't know what to do. So quite often what I'll do is I'll take a chalky SP value that I really like and I'm comfortable with. But then in my second starting pitcher spot, I'm more prone to take a chance on a high K rate guy that is cheaper, that comes with a lot more volatility that people are going to be off of. Because again, Ks are king in DFS baseball. And that's where I'll try and differentiate is I'll go cheaper in that second starting pitcher spot with a higher K rate guy. And that gives me more flexibility in terms of stacking a more expensive team or even just fitting in a one-off like Giancarlo Stanton's at home in Yankee Stadium against a bad left-handed pitcher. And his ISO in those situations is like 350 plus. And it's insane. The power upside that you're going to get.
What else do I need to know about tournaments, just from this sort of perspective? We talk about chalk, and if I'm not good at identifying who's going to be highly owned and who's not going to be highly owned, you keep mentioning Coors Field. So anyone playing in Coors Field, you can basically bet on to be chalky that day. Are there other teams or certain players that end up being highly owned on a consistent basis?
So Coors Field, first of all, is an anomaly. It has the biggest hitting park factor by a lot. And I hate to say this, I don't have a good answer as how to treat Coors Field in tournaments. In most situations, I err on the side of being contrarian because of the variance of the situation, but Coors Field is such an outlier. Yes, those guys are going to be chalky, but sometimes it's really hard to win without some of those guys in your lineup. And if you're fading Coors as a game theory play every night of the year, I don't know if it's plus EV, even with the higher ownership. So what I might do in Coors to switch it up sometimes is, maybe mini stack, not full stack Coors, but mini stack it and do that with another lower owned stack, or stack it with some of the guys that you think will be lower owned in Coors, which the bottom of the lineup guys, again, they're somewhat scary in the National League, but you could get some better ownership on those guys. I remember one game Arizona was in Coors Field and Yasmani Tomas was hitting down in the lineup instead of up in the lineup. And the ownership disparity between him and the outfielder in the up lineup was like 30 percentage points. It was something wild. And then Tomas had a huge game and the leverage you created there was huge. So I think there are ways that you can create leverage with Coors without fading it. I think that's kind of the best way to approach Coors Field because it's such of an anomaly. But as far as other chalky situations, Texas is quite often pretty chalky. Arizona as a stadium has been chalky in the past, but they're putting in a Humidor this year. And I did a podcast with Derek Carty, who has the bat projection system on Roto Grinders. And he's found that the Humidor could have a big impact on Arizona, not just dampening the offensive environment there, but actually making it neutral or even pitcher friendly. So I think early in the season, maybe that's a spot where you can be contrarian if people are going heavier on Chase Field because of the historical park factor, not realizing that, hey, it's not going to play like this moving forward. But there's no other situation that's comparable to Coors.
Okay, so I want to talk about the Arizona situation just for a second. You said that might be a nice spot to fade early in the season if people are going to pile on, but isn't the general consensus that this Humidor is really going to suck the power out of it? I mean, it's difficult to translate daily fantasy baseball and DraftKings baseball into season long, but it seems like a lot of these Diamondbacks players, like Paul Goldschmidt, for example, have dropped outside the top 5 in overall drafts, and now he's number 9 or number 10. It seems like people are hip that this is happening. Could actually playing players there before we have a large enough sample to figure out what's actually going on actually be the contrarian move?
So I guess we won't know until we see the ownerships, but I would say 2 things about that. One, people might be dropping the season-long values, but a lot of the models and stuff day to day, when people go do their research, they might grab the wrong park factor when they're doing their models. And they just might make a mistake there in that regard. And they just look at the model, they don't adjust for it, and they see Paul Goldschmidt rated super high. So I think there's that part to it. The second part is, while people are adjusting for it and they think it matters, I don't know if they realize how much it might matter. Like, it could not just dampen the offensive environment. It could become somewhat pitcher friendly. Like, if it has the same impact it had on Coors, because the thing with Coors that people don't realize, they say, oh, they put in the Humidor and it's still a scoring bonanza. It was that much crazier before the Humidor. So I still think that you're probably going to be more contrarian fading Chase Field, but it'll be interesting to see if I'm wrong. But there are some other things you can do beginning of the season, like beginning of the season specific strategies, because the cold weather, Pat, has a pretty large impact on a couple of things. Most notably, it's going to help pitchers because there's a lot of studies done that the colder the temperature and depending where the humidity is, it's going to reduce the offensive impact. So I think what you can do early in the season, and it could also dampen pitcher K rates at the same time. So I think you can take some chances early in the season on pitchers that are in, cold weather environments, might not cost as much, and you don't have to feel that pressure to spend all the way up to the top tier starting pitching, because the gap between them might not be as high early in the season. And then conversely, this might allow you to pay for some expensive hitters that are in domed environments. I know Chase Field's one of them, and I'm saying to fade Chase Field, but that's kind of a specific thing. But, stadiums like Milwaukee that are plus hitters parks, and they're not going to be affected by the cold weather. So I think that's an early season wrinkle to keep your eye on.
So if the weather plays a factor that way in terms of heat versus cold and pitchers early on in the season, I know weather can wreak havoc throughout the course of the season as it pertains to picking your players on any sort of slate. What's the best way to monitor the weather and potentially use it to your advantage?
There's this site called Daily Baseball Data that I use. I know on dailyroto.com, our lineups page, we're going to have the weather as well, where you can check out what the humidity and the temperature is going to be. One of the big things to keep in mind, though, is what's the usual temperature at a park? Because Texas, for example, has a very high park factor for hitters. And sometimes in the summer, people will be like, oh, it's 80 in Texas. It's hot, and it's already a good park factor. Well, that park factor takes into account that it's usually pretty hot in Texas. So if you're adding on to that it's 80 and you think that's another plus, you're double counting. You want to be careful of that. So you want to compare the park factor to what's the usual temperature in the park. Now, when it's going to get 100 plus in Texas, then you're pretty happy. Okay. So, and it's similar, like Wrigley is an outlier one too, where when the wind's blowing out in the summer and it's a little bit hotter, it has a significant impact on the run scoring there, particularly in terms of home run rate. So, those are some of the things to keep in mind. Is if you're taking into account temperature, make sure that it's relative to the average temperature of the ballpark, or else you're going to be guilty of double counting things.
The only other one I can think of is when we play NFL and we have a high-level player who is questionable to play. It generally gets most of the masses off of that player because they don't want to be having to make lineup decisions 5 minutes before lock. But Arian Foster was always the biggest example. It's like, oh, he's not going to play, he's not going to play, he's not going to play, he's not going to play. And then, an hour before lock happens on Sunday, it's like, oh, Arian Foster's playing. And you get such a decreased ownership on him that you almost just play him every week, and hopefully he goes for an Arian Foster roster game. Do we have similar situations in baseball when we don't know if a game is going to be rained out or not? Obviously, you inherit a lot of risk if it is, because then you just get zeros across your lineup, but does it squash the ownership of players in those games, and you might allow yourself to get access to someone who would relatively be a chalky player in this spot if the weather was nice, and now people are a bit too tentative and they back off that position?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think in tournaments, taking advantage of people being scared of the weather is a good move, because you look at the overall percentage of games that get rained out, it's not that high. The thing that's hard is if the game gets rained out and you stacked it, you got to be prepared that you're fully taking a zero. But again, if you're entering tournament lineups, your goal has to be to have a good chance at a top 1% lineup. You're not playing tournament lineups to min cash. That's a nice fallback. You're playing because you have a chance to win. That's where the EV of a tournament comes in, is by having a chance at that top overall prizes, their top heavy prizes. So keep that in mind. So I do think you can take that chance. There's some situations where we look at a game and we just know it's going to get rained out and canceled. But there's a lot of times where it's 50-50 and people just don't want to deal with it. And I think with hitters in particular, you can really take on that chance, do a stack, because people, it's just so easy for them to pivot to somewhere else and not deal with the risk. In cash games, I have the exact opposite strategy. Don't mess with the weather, because the hitter variance is high enough anyway. So why would you, take a chance at a guy that could get a confirmed zero in your lineup? So very different approaches on weather based on the two games. Cash games, conservative. I think tournaments, it does make sense to be aggressive, but what we always say is there's smart contrarian, there's stupid contrarian. Make sure it's a good spot, and these are hitters, as you said, Pat, that might normally be chalky in other circumstances. Don't do it just because, no one's going to play it, but it's a 3 total game and, 3 total team, and no one was going to play him anyways, even if the weather was perfect.
You keep mentioning park factors. Can you explain park factors a little bit for people? And besides Coors Field in Texas, like you mentioned, what are the top hitters parks in baseball right now, and which are the best pitchers parks?
Yeah, so I like to look at the park factors by handedness on Fangraphs, which are a very useful tool, because they break it down too by like single, double, triple, home run, because you do want to take into account the skill of the hitter. But in general, what a park factor is telling you is, how much above average expectations should we have for, a home run by a left-handed hitter in Coors Field relative to the average park environment. So everything's kind of standardized and compared to a neutral park environment. And if you look at it by handedness, I think it's a big deal, because hitter in Yankee Stadium, which is a really good hitter's park, is going to have a much bigger advantage if they're a left-handed hitter, because there's a short porch and right, and you increase that home run park factor specifically for left-handed batters than it is for right-handed batters. So and the other thing to take into account is if you're a speedy, a singles doubles hitter, the home run park factor might be increased in a park, but that might not do you a whole lot of good. So you don't want to overcount for that for a hitter who's not in position to take advantage of it anyways. But just taking a look at some of the park factors that are some of the highest. Home runs are the most fun, but like Philadelphia is a great park for right-handed power. Cincinnati is one of the best hitters parks out there. Milwaukee's really good. A lot of the AL East parks are good between Yankee Stadium. Fenway Park's another one of those parks where there's a pretty divergent park factor for right and left-handed hitters, actually even more so than Yankee Stadium, because Yankee Stadium is still good for everyone, whereas Fenway for right-handed hitters with that, the monster in left field right now, it's a boon for right-handed hitters overall. But for left-handed hitters, it's actually average to slightly below average, which people don't realize. So those left-handed hitters, when they go on the road, it matters. And that's a big thing with park factors too, that I want to make sure set straight is however you're evaluating the hitters, you want to make sure you're evaluating them correctly. So if you're looking at a hitter's weighted on base average that's not adjusted for park factor, for example, you don't want to like double count their park factor. Let's say they're at home in Coors and they have a huge wallboard because they play half their games in Coors. You don't want to double count that. But let's say you have a left-handed hitter in Fenway who goes to Yankee Stadium. That's a big shift. What we're looking at is that park shift. That park shift is really positive for that hitter. And that's when you want to start giving them a bonus on top of whatever baseline you're using, assuming that baseline's, not park adjusted to begin with.
Well, so does that make something like weighted runs created plus something that actually factors in park factors? a more valuable tool in maybe evaluating this?
I think weighted runs created plus, it definitely makes a lot of sense. I just haven't been able to work that into a model. And as much as I have weighted on base average and ISO, which are two statistics that are generally not adjusted for park factor. So I mentioned those statistics matter, and keep that in mind that if you've got a guy with a really good WOBA, a really good ISO over, whatever time frame you want to use for your baseline, that is not a park adjusted statistic. So at dailyroto.com, when we do our projections, we're accounting for where they've played their game so that we can, then take a unadjusted weighted on base average and isolated power and adjust them for kind of new. Basically, we take them, we neutralize them for the home park, and then we reapply the park factor for wherever the game is going to be played that day.
Let's talk about tournament selections as it pertains to large-scale GPPs and tournament mass multi-entries. If I'm me, and let's say I have a $500 to invest in daily fantasy on DraftKings right now, I want to start the fantasy baseball season. A, is that enough? Or do I really have to figure out what types of tournaments I need to be playing because of that?
I think, any amount is enough. I think you probably need, I guess I would say you probably need at least $100 if you want to withstand the variance in your playing tournaments. But I would be careful with your bankroll, not play more than try and keep it to 10% of your bankroll a given night, maybe even 5 to 10%. And it depends what type of tournaments you want to play. You asked me if you had a single entry in a cash game to enter, how would you want the field size to be? And I said for a large field double up, I want it to be really big. I actually think your edge is better there. For a tournament, if you have a single entry, I do think, you might want to avoid those super huge fields where people have lots of entries and they can stack 20 different teams, 5 different ways, or not 20, that math doesn't add up, but 5 different teams, 10 different ways, for example. I think that's going to hurt your ability to make a top 1% lineup. So if you're a person that only wants to enter one lineup, I think you want to stick to single entry and 3 max type tournaments. As I mentioned too, in those tournaments, if you're willing to withstand the variance, I do think there's an even more likelihood of realizing the reward of being contrarian if you're right on a given night, because the ownerships can get inflated. Now, if you want a multi-entry, the moonshot's a good one. I think all of the sub $4 tournaments, sub $5 tournaments on DraftKings now, Pat, correct me if I'm wrong, but are 20 maxes. So that's a nice tournament to be able to mass multi-entry without a huge portion of your bankroll and without having to worry about competing with someone who's putting in 150 lineups.
And not even the one person putting in the 150 lineups, the 250 people putting in 150 lineups.
Exactly. And that's when, if you're having a single entry, it's really hard to compete. I'll enter those lineups. I'll enter those contests because I'm entering 150 lineups myself. But if you don't have the bankroll to do that, I used to think otherwise, that it didn't matter as much, but I think now, with DFS optimizers, we're gonna have a DFS optimizer as part of our MLB package. A lot of other sites have DFS optimizers and whatnot, where people can make smarter lineups a little bit quicker. They can do their stacks a little bit easier. That it is becoming, more and more difficult to have a single entry competing against multiple people's multiple entries.
If you're playing in a single entry tournament, as let's say you build 150 lineups, but you're also going to play in a single entry as well, how do you pick that one lineup for the single entry? Because this is honestly the thing I struggle with the most when it comes to all daily fantasy sports.
Honestly, I struggle with this in baseball more than any other sport.
So it's just hard, is what you're saying.
It's really hard because, one, the ownerships are somewhat tough to predict. I gave some tips on how you can do that, but still, it's always difficult to tell, what's going to be the chalk, especially among stacks. You can generally tell the top 1 or 2 chalkiest stacks, but beyond that, it's tough to tell. Do I take my 4th or 5th ranked stacks so they won't be chalky? But then I do that, and I find out my 2nd and 3rd ranked stacks ended up, they weren't chalky, and I could have just played them. And I drive myself in circles. It's something that I'm trying to model out a bit more. I've been working on. But as far as a field perspective, it's really difficult to do. Generally, though, I don't worry, again, too much about pitchers. I might be willing to go more contrarian in that 2nd SP spot. But as far as the stack I'm going to use, I just don't want something that I know for sure is going to be somewhat chalky. It's going to be the top 2 or 3 owned stacks. Then I won't use it. Beyond that, though, it's kind of like you want to play your best stack that you think will come in at like 10% ish ownership and not higher than that. Because I really don't think a hitter, like in golf, I don't think any golfer, or 95% of the time, I don't think a golfer should be greater than like 35% owned, just like average, just because of the variance of the situation. I feel similarly about hitters too. I think there's a point where no matter how good of a spot a hitter is in, that the likelihood of them flopping, just because of the way the hitter variance works, they're just not worth being played at a really, really high ownership, with the Coors Field anomaly kind of taking up most of that 5% exception.
If we equated it to a football situation, would it be like the chalky defense that's 35% owned?
Yeah, because with defenses, there's so much variance into how that scoring goes. If they don't score a touchdown, even though they're a good play, they're probably not going to be the highest scoring defense on the week. And fluke things happen, they give up some points. So I do think it's like that in football. I think it might be equivalent to the receiver position too, because the receiver position can be pretty variant, whereas running backs a little bit less variant. So I'd compare it more to the hitters to wide receivers than I would say running backs or quarterbacks.
Any final tournament / GPP tips that you can give out to people that we may not have covered?
I do think that the bottom of the order question that you asked me in cash games, how I had that answer, I think in tournaments, guys that can home run steal from the bottom of the lineup, or are part of really good stacks but won't be owned themselves because they're bottom of the order, I do think there's quite a bit of an edge there in being willing to take those chances in the right spots. I know, a couple of years ago, one of the biggest tournaments I won, I had, I mentioned that night with Yasmani Tomas and Coors Field, where I was able to leverage Coors Field. I had a big night there. I had one with Desmond Jennings for Tampa Bay, who was in a really good hitter's park. He was on the road, but just because he was hitting outside of the top 5 lineup spots, he was quite a bit lower owned than the rest of the Tampa Bay lineup, and he happened to have one of the bigger games. And it's hard to accurately portray the importance of a low ownership hit on your tournament expected value to somebody until they experience it themselves, and they have that 2 to 5% player have a huge night, and they really see the massive impact that can have. So I would say, take your shots in the right spot on some lower owned, lower lineup guys.
Finally, let's talk about what people are doing wrong. What are the biggest mistakes that you see people make in giant field tournaments and in cash games for that matter?
I think the biggest mistakes people get, the 2 buzz things in DFS always are going to be like, what do you do with recent performance? And what do you do with like the small sample size split things, like in the case of baseball, batter versus pitcher? And I think where people need to be careful is how much stock they're putting into recent performance and batter versus pitcher statistics. I'm someone that isn't a big believer in batter versus pitcher statistics, just because I don't think the sample size is big enough to tell us what we need to know. And when I say batter versus pitcher statistics, we're talking about a specific hitter's history against the pitcher that they're facing that night. And a lot of times these sample sizes are either small, or they're old, or they're both. And I do believe that some hitters probably do have an advantage over a specific pitcher. I just don't believe that we have enough data to accurately decide who that is. So I think putting too much stock into that stuff, especially because it can carry weight in terms of ownership in tournaments, is a mistake. And then as far as recent performance, I think you want to isolate the statistics you're looking out for recent performance. If you're just looking at DraftKings points, you're probably making a mistake, because there's a lot of variance what goes into that. If a guy did well because his team happened to go off and he has runs scored, RBIs, he ended up getting 6 plate appearances in game, yeah, he's going to have good DraftKings points. What I want to see is, has he been hitting the ball really well? Has his plate discipline been good? Is he striking out a whole ton more than usual? I think, the plate discipline statistics, the power statistics, and the batted ball statistics tell more of the story. And even then, you got to be careful with the sample size, but I think they tell more of the story, both in terms of BVP and in terms of recent performance, than just like pure DraftKings points or batting average and some of those more, standard stats that people like to look at.
Anything else you think we should mention before we get out of here?
I think that's pretty good. I will say that injured hitters at times will play. People in baseball will play through injuries, and they can drastically underperform their historical baselines for a lengthy period of time. So I will say there is some stock in recent performance if you can put context around it, whether a guy might be hurt. But I think that's where the batted ball data and stuff and the plate discipline data usually can give us a hint whether they're just getting unlucky or there might be something going on there. But and I will say I do move pitcher baselines way more frequently based on recent performance than I will hitter baselines.
All right, tell everyone about the 2018 Daily Roto MLB package and what comes along with that.
Yeah, I'm really excited for it. Last year, we had customizable projections for the first time, which we'll have again, where if you want to change a guy's K rate, his weighted on base average, how many steals per plate appearance you think he'll have, anything, or you can change the pitcher stats, it'll affect the hitter stats. You'll instantly get an updated projection. You can, you think the team total for the Cubs should be 6 and not 5. You can change it to 6 and see how that impacts all the hitters and the opposing pitcher immediately. So I think that's really cool. But this year we've layered on top of that an optimizer, which is going to let you build teams right on the site. And I've also spent a lot of time working on range of outcomes projections. So we talk a lot about tournaments, Pat, but the projection for DFS hitter is likely going to be way off on a given day. We're kind of like Vegas, where they're pinning the median expectation on a run total. We're pinning the median expectation on a projection, but there's so much variability in what's going to happen there. So I've worked on building a range of outcomes model, which says, okay, based on our projection, based on this hitter's volatility and some of their skills, here's the likelihood they're going to score 30 plus points. Here's the likelihood they're only going to score, 0 to 5 points. I think that will help a lot in making your decisions in tournaments, whether you should fade a player, be overweight on a player. So I think, and again, we have that model for pitchers. Pitchers have a bit more of a normal distribution. So it's kind of more of a standard deviation model that we use for pitchers. So I think the optimizer, the range of outcome stuff layer on top, the projections we already had are going to be huge. But as always, you get the lineup alerts, you get the podcast with myself, Drew Dinkmeyer, Logan Hitchcock, Chris Pacheco. So it should be a really fun year. And you can go to dailyroto.com/premium. And we've got the Mayo promo code, Pat, after you. If you enter promo code Mayo, you'll get 10% off any package.
Can I obtain the 10% off using my own name to get it?
There's no rules against it.
I'm definitely doing that then. Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate your time on this, and thank you for breaking this all down for me. I might dip my toes back in to DraftKings baseball this year now that I mean, most of the mistakes that you pointed out were just stuff that I was doing anyway. I should have just said my strategy, played it, and then had you break it down about, hey, this is exactly what you shouldn't be doing.
I mean, give it a try. It's fun. And the nice thing with baseball, too, a lot of the stuff we're talking about, if you want to get really into it, you can get into each of these segments that we talked about and really dig down and get pretty micro. But if you want to get macro and just dabble in tournaments, because of the variance of the sport and the ability to stack and whatnot, it is one of the sports that is appealing to a casual user. Lineups come out a couple of hours before a lock most of the time, so you know who's going to play. You don't deal with like the late scratch problem that you have with NBA at times. So I do think it's friendly for a casual user if they're just, again, willing to be smart with their bankroll, because there's going to be a lot of variance day to day, but you can make lineups that compete without having to put in like a whole ton of time, especially if you subscribe to a site like Daily Roto that puts in that time for you.
Mike Leone, you can follow him on Twitter at 2hats1Mike, and subscribe to the premium product at dailyroto.com/Mayo. Get yourself 10% off. You can follow me at the PME on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram for all my content. The video versions of the show up on the DraftKings YouTube page and the DK Live app, the podcast, anywhere where you can download podcasts, whether that be Spotify, iTunes. iTunes probably a bigger one than Spotify, but both very big in their own rights, and you might use them. If you have Androids, potentially, you have Stitcher, Audio Boom, TuneIn, Google Play, anywhere, like I mentioned, where you can download podcasts. You'll get the Pat Mayo experience, uncut, uncensored, and always free. I'm Pat Mayo. Good luck this DraftKings baseball season. I'll see you next time.